Hello, and welcome to the Ascendant Art Podcast, where we are on a search for art that is ascending above the mainstream. I am your host, Mike, with Catalytic Comics, and our usual team, Andrew with the Harrowing Comic, Joey with Keeper's Cairn, and Vinny with the Adventures of Little Chad. And tonight we've got a special guest with us. We've got Douglas Ernst, the author behind the ongoing Soulfinder comic series. Really amazing artwork, really amazing storytelling. So tell us, how you doing tonight, Doug?
Hey man, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Nice. And yeah, no, just for some of the background on it, I know you've put out a couple of comic books with different artists under this title, Soulfinder. And tell us a little bit about the title overall and about the I guess the 2 episodes you've got out so far.
I checked out the first script for Soulfinder Demons Match, which for those who don't know, it's about combat veteran exorcists that essentially take on this demon called Blackfire and his minions for until the end of time. So Timothy Lim came on. People know him from Common America and Black Ops and the Iconic Comics website or company. And then Matt Weldon and Bill Williams came on with the second book, Black Tide. And then obviously Tim, well, not obviously, but Tim also helped out logistically with a lot of stuff. And he also did a variant cover for us on the second book. And now we're on to the third book, which will be called Infinite Ascent, that also has Matt Weldon of Punchline and Bill Williams. And then I'm going to try and get Brett R. Smith back for a bonus story called War Cry. And then we have Matt's Punchline colorist, Gene, is going to come on and do the main story, which is 72 pages.
I was going to say that sounds like quite a story, and I know you've been teasing some of the artwork out of it, so it definitely looks like it's going to be quite a production once it comes out.
Yeah, this one's the first 2 books were 56 pages each, and then they had 8 pages of bonus material. And like I said, this one's 72 pages, got the 12-page bonus story, and then there'll be bonus art on top of that. So it's going to be a bit of a production, and I want to do a hardcover again like last time, and then ultimately sometime next year do an omnibus with the first 3 volumes.
I was going to say, I have to admit, I really like the hardcovers. They go well on the bookshelf, right? They look very nice and also just feel very substantial when you're looking at them. Not to mention, I know the Black Tide comic also came with a lot of nice bonus content too, with different samples for the production process and the bonus art. Definitely like that part. And I know in my case is kind of just an aspiring writer right now, someone getting started in the writing process. One thing that kind of interested me as you were talking about that is the process of just getting the team together. I know at one point you made a comment about Timothy Lim being part of coordinating that or helping put people together. Yeah, tell me, how did you get the team together? And then I guess we'll dive more into the story after that.
Sure, no problem. So those that have followed me over the years, I had a blog, and I was just doing comics criticism. And at the time I was working for a newspaper, and actually way back when I was working for a nonprofit organization in Washington, D.C. So there was politics and comics. And then from there, I went into YouTube and I started sort of critiquing the mainstream industry for a lack of professionalism. And I ultimately met Tim through my YouTube channel. And then we sort of connected on Twitter, and we got to know each other. Eventually, we ended up talking on the phone. We started bouncing ideas back and forth about comics that we would like to read. And my idea for what eventually would become Soulfinder was very similar to an idea that he had as a kid with a G.I. Joe sort of make your own figure contest, where he wanted to have an exorcist or like a Catholic priest who would take on Cobra's occult magic sort of counterpart or something along those lines.
That is interesting, because that in the G.I. Joe repertoire, the chaplain figure never really popped up, so that would have been a pretty good one.
Yeah, something with Serpentor versus the Exorcist, or who knows? I don't know, but that would have been cool.
I was gonna say, I mean, the comic you guys put out is pretty cool, so it's a case like maybe those guys can take note and come up with a G.I. Joe version of a chaplain just for that. So
yeah, a lot of people that aren't really familiar with it, when they hear the initial concept about combat veterans that get out, they've kept their faith intact. There's very few people that go into the priesthood that actually have combat experience And so then they get recruited into this major order of exorcists that's gone on for many, 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 many years. And so you could tell stories from the Civil War. You could tell, actually, next year I'm writing a script. I'm doing research right now for one of the priest's origin tales in Vietnam. He's not even a priest at this point in time. It's just his time in Vietnam as a tunnel rat, and how that leads into the current era, our time frame of storytelling. So you could do all sorts of cool stories with this particular concept.
That sounds really cool to me. The Civil War one too. That could be really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
No, there's a longtime patron, and she has said over the years, like, you have to do the Civil War one. You got to do the Civil War one. I was like, no, I do want to do that. It's just a matter of time. I also want to do a World War I story as well. So it's just there's so much time in a day.
At the risk of it sounding probably like a saturated market, I'm sure there is a story involving the Crusades in there somewhere too.
Yeah, with the right person. There's only a few people that I would actually trust at this point in time. Timothy Lim and Mark Pellegrini are two people that I would trust. They have a blank check if they ever want to do anything with Soulfinder. Mm-hmm. And then there's another friend of mine, Mike McNulty, who he's done work for Spider-Man Crawl Space, and he also has worked for Bam Smack Pow doing comic reviews. I would trust Mike as well if he ever wanted to take a crack at it.
Because I was going to say too, because you mentioned about the Civil War and just the research process. Because on the one hand, it's like you often like get these initial flashes of inspiration of saying like, oh hey, like wouldn't it be cool to take this story concept and then put it into this particular concept? But then when you get down to writing, it's like, man, like what do I really know about this? So yeah, tell us a little bit about, just for the ones you've done so far or coming up, just what that research process looks like.
Yeah, so for the first book, actually, if you look behind me, and you can't see the other bookshelf, but I need to do, like, I am a practicing Catholic, but I wasn't into exorcisms per se. Yep. Like, I knew of them, but I didn't know exactly how all of that went transpired. If a priest was going to perform it, are there certain rules involved? Yes, actually, there's many, many rules, and there's certain conditions that have to be met. People think that you could just like walk into a priest and like ask for an exorcism. It's like, no, you basically need to have your doctors and psychologists and people essentially sign off and say like, we don't know what the heck's going on. like we don't know. We've tried everything under the sun, and there's paperwork that you literally, at least in the United States for sure, they probably fudge things in maybe some other countries or whatnot. But so I had to do a lot of research to make sure that I wasn't being accused of being a heretic by people after they read it. So there is a lot of reading and research that goes into these books.
Hold on. A comic book writer researching and trying to make sure their content is actually good. That's not how things work, Doug. That's not. This is 2021. I don't know if you've read DC and Marvel lately, but you're just definitely gonna never get hired over there.
It's the current
year, dude. Yeah, that was my critique for many years. Is some of these stories, they demand some form of research. So I've said before, if you're writing on Tony Stark and you don't know Business 101. Like you've never read a book on business, or maybe you even looked into, I don't know, find some other entrepreneurs who are super successful, an Elon Musk type character, and maybe look into the mindset of an entrepreneur or something along those lines. If I can tell immediately that you don't know the first thing about business, when I'm reading an Iron Man book, you're just spouting off nonsense, it takes me out of the story. So I want the author to have done at least some semblance of research before they start writing.
I can give you the formula. It's real simple. Take a character you really like, neuter them, kill them off, hand their mantle to somebody else, preferably somebody who checks a lot of boxes. Done.
That's pretty much, the modern mainstream comic book industry. It's not about storytelling first and foremost anymore. It's about showing people that you're a really good person because you believe X, Y, and Z that your editors believe, and what you see on your favorite cable news show.
Wow, this actually happened really quick. Or it's about a shameless self-insert of your character into the hero role.
There you go.
My name is not Starfire.
Yes.
speaking of researching, I had watched Doug's videos on YouTube years going back. I remember when him, at the time, Diversity in Comics, now I think Comics Matter, when he rebranded his channel. There was another really big hell-raising guy named like Captain Cummings on YouTube way back when, that I think he's dropped off. But those guys were kind of really at the forefront of kind of crystallizing the criticism of the comics industry and I was a $100-$200 a week comic book subscriber at the time. So, and I was like, man, these books kind of suck. I had a lot, I was like, I don't know what's going on. And watching these guys like comment was like, oh, you know what? That is what's going on. It's like the Marvel way is dead, and I don't know why they abandoned it. So I really am excited about this whole indie movement. That's because in my days growing up, indie comics meant like black and white, usually risque content, adult oriented materials that you definitely didn't want your mom taking you to the store to buy. Now taking back the mantle of independent comics and selling really good, well written superhero, or in this case, like a very kind of gothic military kind of Catholic exorcism vibe. It's really hard to describe Soulfinder as much as like, so you can't really just say superhero comic. But I'm just really excited as a comic fan to have that content getting made and having an outlet for my money again that I feel good about spending.
Well, I actually like that you can't quite nail down exactly what genre I'm playing with. That was actually something I talked about with Timothy Lim early on. After he and Mark Pellegrini read the script, they're like, I get like vibes from like the 1980s movies where you can't, it's like a Back to the Future where there's humor in it, but there's action. And a lot of the 80s stories, the Indiana Jones, they played with Goonies, different genres, but you couldn't just peg them down as one specific genre. They were just really good, entertaining, fun movies. And so that's what I was trying to do with Soulfinder. And to your point about indie comics, it's very interesting that today, if you want to be sort of the counterculture or pushing back or the punk or whatever you want to call it, it's actually the people with a functioning moral compass that are trying to tell the classic tales that are the outsiders that are pushing back. They're like the true indies, and the sort of degenerate clown, I don't know, moral relativists. That is now the mainstream.
Yeah, actually, I want to comment on that too, because I was thinking about back in the 80s when I was a kid. Maybe I'm a little bit older than some of you guys, but back in the 80s, there was like some kind of very small but significant media thing for Christian evangelism. It was a little bit like the comics of today, the social justice comics, where they're pushing the message too hard and there's not enough of an art side of it. So it comes off as preachy, and that's exactly what they're doing with social justice comics today. They're sounding like they're created for Sunday school for the social justice agenda or something like that instead of art. And now for example, your comic making, substantial art, interesting art with a Christian message in it, but not tone deaf like that. It's like the whole situation is reversed. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that was one of the things early on. Again, I talked with Tim, is I wanted to tell a story that was informed by my faith, but wasn't beating anybody over the head with it, wasn't using it I wasn't flogging them, using it as a cudgel to say like, hey, if you're not Catholic, then you're a bad guy or something. It was like, no, the story comes first. Exactly. And it's about these men. It's actually the first book in particular, Demon's Match. It's more about the importance and the need for strong male role models. It's about camaraderie, and all of those sorts of things. So you have this war veteran who's, it's been quite a while, so I guess it won't spoil too many things, but he was injured in war. He lost his friends in war, his platoon mates. And so he had to live with that sort of thing. And then he enters into this order of exorcists where, again, you have a Vietnam veteran mentor who he has his own sort of past that I explore in future stories here. But it's a lot of it is about fathers and sons. And like I said, strong male role models and the need to have them in society.
So, is there a lot of exploration into PTSD and survivor's guilt?
That's one of those things where you don't want it to come across as Hollywood always has it, where every single veteran, a lot of times they're just waiting to snap and they're going to go insane or whatever. So I wanted to try and honor veterans and combat veterans in a way where I'm not sugarcoating anything. These people went through extremely traumatic situations, and they might have literal like physical scars and their own psychological scarring that they need to heal from. But at the same time, they're good men that are trying to do the best and find the right thing to do in any given situation. I mean, on some level, it explores those sorts of things, but it doesn't dwell on them. And I tried my best not to cover them in a way where, I don't know, maybe left-wing filmmakers in Hollywood, they really like the snappity snap PTSD veteran thing, and I didn't want to get too into that.
In some cases, it almost feels like some of these creators oversimplify their understanding of the different archetypes, and in that sense, like oversimplifying the veteran archetype to be having just those properties. And this also leads me into a question about this as well, because kind of like within the Ascendant art group, one saying we have about aesthetics is that very good art, aesthetic art, is first and foremost true. And when we talk about the counterculture and about kind of the indie comics community, that it seems like what we're starting to see is what I think some of the art community and what kind of like edges of the art community should be, which is the place where kind of like that discovery of the greater whole is supposed to be happening, right? The mainstream is supposed to take the truth that has been discovered and then, just really propagate it and lift it up. Kind of like how comic companies used to be going out to the indies, finding great talent and saying, okay, now we're going to take your talent, add corporate resources to it so you can do really great things. And now that function seems to have almost broken down, we're back to that almost basic rediscovery in projects like what you're doing, what the guys at Iconic are doing, as well as a few others that we see out in Comicsgate and some of the other spaces.
Some people ask me from time to time, they're like, can the mainstream industry be saved? And I always say, well, the mainstream industry is just a reflection of the broader culture. So you have people that are writing superhero tales. They're writing Spider-Man or Superman or Batman, Captain America, but they don't even believe in good. Like there is an objective good and evil in the world. It's always not the truth. It's my truth. Whatever I decide. So it's like they don't even know what good versus evil is. They don't believe in it, but then they're writing these stories about these heroes. And so you have a smaller population pool of people in the United States and various countries that actually do have a functioning moral compass, and they're interested in telling good storytellers. They're writers. They're true storytellers. They're not activists masquerading as storytellers. And so on some level, it's logical that would be where you would find individuals that care about projecting the good, the true, and the beautiful in their art.
Yeah, it's really hard to write about superheroes when you have no principles, because that's kind of what they're built on. Is there's some principle that each of them stands for: truth, justice, the American way, service to country, justice for criminals. Like there's no superhero that's like, you know what, I just want to sit at home and eat Cheetos and ice cream and watch Netflix all night. That's not a superhero.
Or in a similar sense, I know some of these artists now actually identify more with villains than heroes.
Oh, they do.
Yes. And that's where you see the popularization of characters like Harley Quinn, because in their mind, it's like, well, because you're a villain, because you don't have a moral compass, it's like, oh, now I've got some power, some ability, and I can just do whatever I want with it. And you're right, that is one of the challenges that some people in like the professional creator space, like they couldn't write Superman, because the thing is, Superman's not super because of his abilities. He's super because he doesn't immediately turn around and use those to take over the world. It's the application of those principles and the testing of them that makes the story interesting, not the right, like I can lift heavy things and fly faster than a speeding bullet and all this.
And it happened in regular media too, because Captain America in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they made a point of making the drama come from the fact that his values and morals were unambiguous to him. He didn't change them. And it was like, now how does it get tested? One of his, good values, stand by your friends. But what happens if your friend is a brainwashed assassin. Like, you can make dramatic storylines without having to give your hero a feat of clay and make him like, going Watchmen with your heroes instead of, and reading comics my whole life. Watchmen was a great series, but it kind of ruined a lot of modern comic books because it made it like that, in that era with Frank Miller doing Daredevil, with Gibbons and Moore doing Watchmen, to a lesser extent Squadron Supreme, which predates Watchmen and kind of addressed some of the same things. It became really in vogue to try to like make your heroes just like, terrible people with failings, instead of trying to make the drama come from having, unambiguously heroic people living in a world that isn't heroic, which I think is really more interesting in a lot of ways than what we're getting.
Yeah, you had a lot of people after Watchmen that they tried to pull it off, that sort of deconstruction, but they didn't have the skill to do it. And then, like you said, it's easy to tear something down. It's easy to do the deconstruction process. But when you're dealing with these iconic heroes, ultimately, when you put a character through a crucible, they're supposed to, or a gauntlet, or whatever you want to call it, on the other end, they're supposed to come out better, stronger, wiser men and women. But these days, they just keep tearing them down until there's nothing left. And it's been a sad thing to watch over the past couple decades.
It's the most basic form of storytelling. You can't have a hero's journey if your hero could kick the big bad's ass right from the get-go. There's supposed to be a growth arc. There's supposed to be some sort of test that then gives them the knowledge or the weapon they need to defeat the big bad. But they don't, because it's all self-inserts, they don't want to see it. I don't want to have to build and learn. I'm good enough. I could beat this guy now. So we'll just tell a story where I'm awesome from the beginning, and you get something like Captain Marvel.
It's always feminist characters that are like that. It's always a female character, and it's always pushing a feminist agenda these days when you see that model.
I almost feel like we should create a new version of the hero's journey, because as you know, like the hero's journey starts from the call and the mentor, and you cross the threshold, and there's a whole process to that. But I almost feel like we should just, as kind of a fun meme, create another journey, which is the person just realizes, oh, I just need to know that I'm already awesome, and the story is over.
And Tila, all you have to do is face your worst fear. Oh, your worst fear is how awesome you are? Well, yeah, that makes sense.
The only question is,
fuck you, He-Man.
Do we call that the Tila, or do you call it the Brie Larson? I mean, I just don't know which is the better name for that hero's journey.
You call it the Ray. I mean, she's the classic Mary Sue now, right?
I mean, but that was the same story. Like in Captain Marvel, it was just like, oh my God, I've already been awesome this whole time, and I didn't know it. Well, let me now just defeat everybody and break the entire power spectrum of the Marvel Cinematic Universe because I can. It's fun stuff. I think I'd like to ask Doug, because you mentioned the themes of kind of fatherhood and traditional values and things, and obviously for people who might read my content on a weekly basis where it's just like a comic strip, the backbone of it is kind of just traditional values being presented in a fun comic strip kind of way. So it kind of speaks to me very much in what I'm already doing on my content.
It's the most wholesome thing on Twitter.
Thank you. I appreciate that. But I want to see, do you find that obviously when you're talking about doing something like Soulfinder, where they're dealing with exorcism and the elements like that, it's going to have inherent to that kind of storytelling a lot of negative, not very wholesome kind of content, right? People in that kind of situation, if they're in a demonic possession kind of storyline, are going to be in bad places. How do you, from a storytelling perspective, kind of thread the needle with, I guess, getting across the traditional values aspect that you want, but still maintaining the, like you said, the accurate kind of situation of dealing with exorcism? It's kind of a weird question, but I'm kind of want to think about your process for that.
So I grew up on 80s Marvel comics, Daredevil, Frank Miller. As a little kid reading about Daredevil, you got prostitutes in there and all of that.
Oh, and he worked in the Catholic stuff so hard in that whole run.
But the 80s comics, there's a period of time where they explored darker elements of society or darker themes. But at the end of the day, going back to the moral compass sort of situation, the characters still basically had a moral compass. And at the end of the day, they were stronger for everything. There was a good message at the core of these stories. The writers and the artists still, they were operating within a culture that was pseudo pretty healthy for the most part. And so with Soulfinder, yes, I do explore darker elements. If you are somebody that has aligned your will so much with the demonic that you actually would become possessed, you're going to be in a bad place psychologically and spiritually. But it never gets to, it's not gruesome for the sake of being gruesome. There's not, the language is not foul. So ultimately, yeah, it is a very tough needle to thread. And you're talking about the 80s and some of the too on the nose and preachy sort of like the Christian fare. It's difficult for me because sometimes people, Christians in particular, they will ask me questions where they essentially want the Finding Nemo version of Soulfinder, and I have to explain to them, you're not gonna get the happy face exorcism. I don't even know what, and then they just sort of scuttle away. Like, I guess that's not for me. So that is a challenge. But I think if people watched Goonies, the first early Indiana Jones movies, those
Monster
definitely
Squad.
explored.
Come on, let's throw out some Monster Squad love. That, I mean, that's exactly the kind of needle that movie was threading. Personal favorite of mine.
If you were able to see the Indiana Jones movies as a kid, then I think that Soulfinder would be something appropriate for, I don't know, 10, 11, 12-year-olds and up.
At that age, I was watching someone chant Kali Ma and rip a heart out. So I mean, I think we all, I think everyone in our age group, I'm 40 now,
I was gonna say,
kind of has that in memory etched in their head. Kali Ma.
I still remember the scene where they opened the Ark of the Covenant in Indiana Jones, and people's faces were melting, and I was like, oh no.
They invented the PG-13 rating for Temple of Doom, and it was I think Gremlins got actually released first under PG-13, but the rating itself got created because they're like, well, this is an R, but it's definitely something parents should be, talking to their kids before they go see.
Right. Yeah, and that was something where, I don't know. Again, I tried to do my best to tell a story that sort of introduced a younger audience to these darker elements, but without doing it in a way where it was just too much, and a parent would be like, I can't trust my kid with this material yet. But yeah, at the same time, the adults could appreciate the message that I was trying to get across to the audience.
Sounds pretty cool to me. How do you visually portray exorcisms? Like the classic holding up the cross? Do you add light effects of some kind? Do you see the demon kind of half coming out of a person?
So with Demon's Match, essentially there is a match that when you strike it, you essentially are introduced to the spiritual realm. And so the demons in that particular tale take various forms, snakes, demon dogs, those sorts of things. And then in the second book, there's a black ink, I guess. There's a character who are a demon called Abyss. And if you get this black ink in your eye, you are taken to the abyss, which is, again, the spiritual realm where you can see these demons. One's an anglerfish, another's like a giant squid demon sort of thing. So I need to find a way where these characters can see what's going on in the spiritual realm. And so I've done that in both books. And then again, in the third, there's some way that hopefully creatively works and ties in with the themes that people be like, okay, I could buy it. That would allow the characters to see into the spiritual realm.
Now, on just a structural question, you're making this with Iconic Comics, the same guys who do Common America and Tim Lim and all the, your book though is very different than what people
Seems
are getting
a lot
with
grittier.
Yeah, than what people are getting with Common America or Black Hops or some of the other content that is coming from Iconic Comics. Do you find that, and this is from a business question, because a lot of people hopefully listening to this are also maybe thinking of content creation and serving a market and finding their audience and things like that. Obviously, your audience for your content is going to probably skew different, maybe some crossover, but was that something when you and Tim Lim were talking that they were, we were happy about for Iconic Comics to have a diverse spectrum of comic book offerings? Or was that something where there was discussion about how to kind of blend yours into the existing content that was being created under the brand? Most of the Iconic brand is kind of wrapped around Common America at this point, and your
Is it
stuff,
an iconic shared universe?
yeah. So I would like to find out how you kind of picture your stuff fitting into the imprint. It's not like, within Marvel Comics, DC, we're used to having very diverse, but they usually have sub imprints. Like Sandman is under Vertigo, and I kind of feel like Soulfinder would kind of be more of a, if we were talking a DC context, a Vertigo comic, whereas Common America is maybe mainline DC. Is that something that is talked about over at Iconic Comics?
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely an astute observation. So years ago, when Tim and I were talking about what would eventually become Iconic, thanks to the owners, we do not own it. It's a running joke that I'm the secret president, but I'm not the president. But we wanted to, we were worried about getting kicked off one of the crowdfunding platforms, and that people wouldn't particularly like what we stand for. I worked for a newspaper. The opinion section is definitely right-leaning. We'll just put it that way. I have a history. Like I said, I worked for a conservative think tank many, many years ago. And so we wanted to basically be bulletproof, where if we got kicked off of a crowdfunding platform, didn't matter. We had a place where we could ultimately fund and get our message out and essentially say, go here. This is our fallback area. We still exist. You can still get our books and maybe even raise our funds here on a long enough timeline. So eventually that would become Iconic Comics. And the idea was, okay, well, now we want to have creators under one roof that believe in solid art and solid storytelling and professionalism and getting books out to people in a timely manner at a fair price. And it doesn't really matter if Common America is anime, manga, and mine's more into this horror genre, but then you have a Punchline with Matt and Bill Williams. It's more of a traditional sort of superhero fare. And so you're giving people different flavors that they could pick when they go to the website. And it's like, okay, well, this is what I want, boom, boom, boom. But I know ultimately that I'm going to get solid art and solid storytelling from these people. No matter what I pick here, even if I don't like that particular genre, I could acknowledge that this is good storytelling.
So what you're really going for is Iconic's brand is just going to be quality, not necessarily a specific genre. It's just going to be, I know I get a book of high print quality. I know I get art of high quality and writing of high quality, but it can be diverse within genres and spectrum within that.
Right. And now you even have Eric Canetti, who's come on with this Ark Athena book. Pro, who's kind of come under the Iconic roof. And so essentially, I don't want to put words in the owner's mouth of Iconic, but they're looking for, again, people that just want to put out quality work in a timely manner at a fair price, and just men and women of principle. Hopefully, I'm very happy with everybody that's under the Iconic roof as of right now. I am very happy. If I suppose if down the line somebody was added that I didn't like, I would be respectful of that person or whatever. But everybody that works there is releasing books through them right now. Tim and Mark and all the other guys, they're just super solid dudes. I got to meet them at Bell County Comic Con this summer down in Texas, and just really cool dudes.
Absolutely. And I know, especially in the case of, was it with Mark Pellegrini, like I've just noticed how much he engages the community and how much he's also given back, whether that's with his Writing 101 that he did on YouTube, which I have studied that one quite a bit for my own writing. And I guess also one other thing too is, now that you've put a couple of titles out, I saw from your blog, you mentioned paying attention to certain details, even ones as simple or small as budget or just Iconic generally. I know you guys really emphasize on getting stuff delivered, which, by the way, with my Indiegogo campaign contribution recently being fulfilled, again, you guys deliver, which I love that. What are some of the things that you either learned or early on you said, like, I'm going to get this right?
So yeah, you mentioned the budgeting. A lot of people, they like the promotional aspect of getting their comic out there. They like going on social media. They like getting on YouTube or Instagram or Facebook or whatever and pushing the book. But it's very easy if you're not on top of the accounting. Some stuff is not very sexy. Accounting is not sexy. But if you don't do it correctly, you can quickly find yourself in massive amounts of debt, particularly if you start doing international books. That is a nightmare, and then that was exacerbated by the pandemic. So accounting is very important. If you're running the campaign, you have to wear many hats. And so how do you energize the entire team? How do you get the most out of your team? How do you keep people on task? Everybody has their, especially in indie comics, everyone has their own lives. They have their own issues or problems, and family members get sick or they get sick, and you're on a deadline. So you're trying to do all of these things. When you're a writer, you're also sort of a director and a cinematographer, depending on your artist and how much detail they want to put into the script. And so these are all things that a lot of times people, they just like, oh, I'm going to make a comic. And it's like, yes, but then there's, you could get into printing, and there's all sorts of stuff that people don't know about, having to get the proofs right and the bleeds. And if you get anything wrong along the way, it could massively derail your book and the release date and when it comes out. And so there's just many things to think about. And I would say, don't get into indie comics lightly and think that you can produce a quality book on the cheap or cut corners, because it's not a good idea to try and cut corners.
I was going to say, I've started to sample a number of books, and you can always tell when someone cuts corners, and that's either in the art quality or in the case of printing. You can see that as well. It's also funny too. You, just as you're talking about it, you reminded me of my mother. Actually, she's worked in the printing business her whole life, all the way back to when cut and paste was you were cutting and pasting film negatives to assemble, like, in a dark room. And you're right, like, that is one of those components that, even down to, I remember being asked recently once about, like, hey, like, what are the dimensions of paper you're doing this on? And until you try to make it, like, you never think about questions like that.
Yeah, and it's something that I've learned along the way. Actually, that gets back to the crowdfunding. Leave yourself plenty of space for, if something can go wrong, it will go wrong. The worst case scenario in terms of your timeline, because all sorts of bizarre things will pop up, and you will find out, like, oh, I didn't know about this, and this is going to move things back 2 weeks because I either have to learn about it or I have to work with the printer and say, like, I'm an idiot. Can you help me? If you have a right relationship. So there was a guy named Joseph at API who helped me out tremendously. He recently passed away.
Very tragic.
But he was huge. Yeah, Joseph Healy, in terms of getting Black Tide out and getting the hardcovers out. People that are happy with them, they could thank Joseph for the hard work, because he was just giving me crash courses on all sorts of things that I didn't know about. So I'm sitting there writing notes, and yeah, it's definitely a process, and you have to be willing to do your homework and be a good student if you want to get your books out on time.
Yes, indeed. And when you mentioned that too, now, of course, I know a couple weeks back we talked about that whole, like, absolutely bizarre, like, Mike S. Miller incident about how he threw, I think, the same printer under the bus.
Oh,
and I think
man,
you saw
I got
that
heated
episode
about that one.
Yeah, that was so shocking. But that's also too, I think, another aspect of this that's easily overlooked is also this entire industry, I think, is built on relationships. And yeah, just tell us about that side of it, because it does seem like as you do this, you will get to know so many people by name.
Even with your own creative team. So I've had people here and there tell me that I should have been a bit more demanding on my books to get, quote unquote, my vision out there. But I like to collaborate with my colorist, Brett R. Smith. Again, worked at Marvel, DC. He's got a great cinematic eye. Matt Weldon, Tim, they both have great ideas. It's like the parable, the blind men and the elephant. I wrote this script. I have an idea of what it is. But even though I wrote it on some weird level, I only see the tail of the elephant. And Tim and Brett and Matt and Bill Williams and Mark Pellegrini, they're looking at all sorts of different angles. And so for me, if I want the best Soulfinder story possible, I'm going to contact people that I think are intelligent and sharp and on the ball and say, what do you think? And if they come up with a better idea than me, I need to be humble enough to be like, wow, that's a really good idea. Tim and Mark did a lot in terms of helping me build out the universe and the history of the Soulfinders very early on. They did like sort of a Soulfinder character Bible. They're really big into that. So I had sort of the skeleton of everything, and they started putting meat on the skeleton. And I was like, that is a really good idea. That's a really good idea. Okay, start writing it in there. So sometimes people want me to be a dictator on the team, and it's like, you can do that one time. I could do that with one book, but then Tim and Mark will never talk to me again. They want nothing to do with me. And you have to be very careful, because if you burn bridges with people, especially very talented people, you're just shooting yourself in the foot. It doesn't even make any sense.
That's kind of one of the big dangers just to begin with, because you've had those artists in the past. The one I can think of off the top of my head is like Smashing Pumpkins. I know that lead singer like did that whole album by himself, all the instrumentals and everything. And it's like, okay, that's great that's your vision or whatever. But if you want people to help you realize that vision, if you're a good artist and you're a collaborative artist, it will become their vision too. And you have to be willing to share your vision a little, or you're not going to have anybody to work with. And you'll probably never be able to bring that vision forward without help.
Yeah, Billy Corgan on a door. I mean, Billy Corgan is a musical genius. It's sort of like a Prince situation. I'm showing my biases here, but you are correct. He ultimately burned a lot of bridges in his own band, and it took him many, 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 many years to repair those with his former bandmates. And even, I don't, was it DRC? I don't even know if that's really even healed up.
And think about it though, because yes, that one album may have been great, but what negative ramifications were felt on albums to follow? It's hard to work with people you don't like, and you may work with them, but you're not bringing your best if you're working for an asshole. You're like, oh,
exactly.
We just get this shit done and get the fuck out of here, collect my paycheck. That's it.
Yeah, and that's another one of those sort of management issues where if you are the team leader, you better work on your teamwork skills, because there's a lot of different people. You're going to have creative differences along the way. And if you aren't tactful and if you aren't professional, you're going to derail your project. Do you really want to derail your project when you're 20 or 30 or 40 pages into a book and you've spent 10,000, 20,000 or whatever on the book? That's a really bad idea. But yet over and over and over again, you see situations where people get very deep into the project, and for whatever reason, it all implodes upon itself.
Because I was going to say, this also gets into, I think, the concept of comics are collaborative projects. These are people come together to achieve a shared vision, and then also they're commercial projects. And I'm kind of curious, just from your experiences, how many times you've run into people that don't quite have that business sense about them. Because really, like on the business side of things, if you commit to a large project, that is risky. It's always risky, but there are ways you can systematically de-risk it, right? Either through planning or through budget or through like coming up with safe exit points to say, okay, we know things are going sideways if we're not hitting this thing by this time. Tell me just, I guess, some of your experience about that, or if you've got any interesting stories of people who could not quite see that.
Yeah, no, you could go across the indie comics landscape. If you've backed Indiegogo books over the past few years, you know the creators that have burned you. You know the books that have been grossly late to the point where you or your friends wanted refunds on the book, or you got the book and it wasn't as advertised. They said you were going to get X, Y, and Z. You didn't get half of what they said that they were going to give you. And I think a lot of that goes, like you said, just because you're creative, it doesn't mean that you have business acumen. So you could talk about things like the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule. I think Jordan Peterson has talked about that before. Economists talk about it. There's this idea that a lot of times 80% of your output and your growth comes from 20% of the actions that you are performing. And a lot of people don't realize that if you can sort of zero in on the 20% that you need to do to get the 80% output, you get yourself a lot closer to realizing your goal. A lot of people, they don't know how to prioritize. They spend their time doing ridiculous, silly things or procrastinating. They don't want to take advice. That gets back to the humility factor. If you have somebody that tells you, like, listen, this is what you need to do. So for me, when I first started Demons Match, I didn't know what I was doing. That's why I went to Brett. And when I went to Dave Dorman and Tim, and I said, you guys all have experience with this. I'm an idiot. And I admit I'm an idiot. Please help me to not be an idiot. And so a lot of people don't want to do that. They want to believe that they have all the answers right away, like the mainstream industry comics, where they're just the hero from the get-go. They know it all. Their biggest weakness is that they're just too awesome. You don't want to be the mainstream industry hero these days in your own story.
Well, that just kind of makes me feel like I'm being very counterproductive, not getting more content out. It's like one strip a week.
No, I've seen your Twitter feed. It looks like you're doing very well.
You're doing good, man. 1 a week is optimal.
For a comic strip, yes. I mean, eventually, but which was another question, because I know you and you mentioned it earlier as we were talking about your previous work in newspaper and doing some of that stuff, and I know you're now transitioned to working full time on your own content now, like Soulfinder, things like that. How did that decision process kind of go? What went into being, was it like a leap, or were you actually to the point where it was full replacement for what you were getting? I mean, as someone who's starting to make content that's actually being well received kind of right now, it's an intriguing question for me, like for someone who's made that leap now from your previous employment to doing your own content creation as your full-time job, and how that kind of went.
Yeah, initially, so Soulfinder Demons Match, from my perspective, how I define success, was very successful, and I was like, oh, this worked out quite well. We have something to build on here. And so then I was like, okay, I'm going to do another one. We'll see how that goes. Okay, Matt Weldon's on, Bill Williams, Brett's back, Tim's helping out. And I was like, okay, let's see if we could at least retain our readers and hopefully grow on the next one. And my wife said it always seemed like I was going this way, where full-time I would go into indie comics. But along the way, my boss of like roughly a decade, he left and he went to Fox News Digital. A coworker of mine, she then joined him. I got a new boss. My boss started micromanaging me, and I was looking at the numbers. I was looking at Soulfinder. I was looking at what the work that Matt was turning in and talking to him. And I was like, hey, man, are you on board for like, a fourth round? Because he was starting to work on the third one already. And Matt's like, yeah, man, I'm on board. You want to do 4, 5, 6? Like, let's do this. Let's make this happen. So I was like, okay, Matt's on board. He is a genius, and he's a very humble man. He's a very good man. And I was like, all right, I wanted to wait until 3 came out and see if I could get 3 in a row that were successful. But when Matt said he was on board for another one, and I saw what he was turning in, and I got the feedback from Tim and Mark on the third script, and my wife, who doesn't pull punches, I was like, all right, let's just do this and see what happens. When I'm on my deathbed, I at least won't have bizarre regrets about not doing it.
No, it's like I said, it's something I'm dealing with, thinking about myself. When you start making content that actually finds an audience and is doing pretty well. The difference in my model is obviously I'm putting out a free comic strip once a week, so there's not exactly a lot of income potential when you're doing that.
I think on a long enough
not the
time,
same model anyway.
You could put those into a collection. If you do a year of comic strips at some point in time.
Sure.
I'm kind of already thinking and pricing that out. I follow your Twitter feed, so I see the API. Like guys over there, I may have been halfway filling out one of their contact forms like 3 or 4 times to try to think about doing that. In terms of that experience, I mean, we've got people who maybe have content that they could make. It's the publishing side that is a little more difficult. You mentioned how much assistance you got when you were putting your book together. I know you were with API, but can you talk about like for someone who's a novice who's maybe written a book or has, like in this case, maybe a comic book where they have the digital art that's ready to maybe be put into a print file, what that kind of process was like, and kind of what your experience was really getting that help from not knowing anything about it.
Right. So one of the things that I like about API is that they were, if you're printing and your printer is in China, for example, you can't just pick up a phone and call the person and say like, hey, I don't understand this. Can you help me out with this? Or there's a problem. You're at a loss. There's nothing you could really do. But the thing with API is I can always call them up. I can always get somebody on the line who will answer my questions. And if they need something, they know that they can always get with me. So if the DPI or whatever on the file was not quite right or needs to be resized, they had a little issue here or there at the PDF, then I can go back. If I can do it myself, I could do it myself. There was some stuff with the last book where I actually was able to do it myself. If I can't, then I can turn to someone like a Bill Williams on my team, or even a Timothy Lim when time allowed. So surrounding yourself with just good dudes who want to help somebody out. It also works in reverse. It's not a one-way street. I'm always a resource for Tim or Mark or just any of those guys. Surrounding yourself with guys who want to help the man next to him, and they don't necessarily expect anything in return. It's just, no, I want all of us to succeed. The rising tide lifts all boats sort of philosophy. Depending on who your printer is and where they're located, if you're going outside of the US and you're in the US, it's going to be a lot more difficult because the learning curve, because you're not going to have anyone. You're just going to have to do it all on your own if you don't have friends who could pick up slack where you don't have it. You don't have that particular knowledge base.
I was going to say it seems very much reminiscent of the book Good to Great, where they're looking specifically at companies with this. And they said very often one place where a lot of kind of enterprises will languish for years is what they call getting the right people on the bus. And then once they're on the bus, getting the right people into the right seat. And because this is, of course, one of the things where we're kind of searching for with our search for Ascendant art is, on the one hand, it's tempting to think it's like if we can just find like that genius out there, right? Like that's the key. But it seems as we're talking about this, it's really more, one is, right, to first have the humility to know that you are not that genius, and there are very few such people, right? I think even indie comics, like that's their advantage, is the new creator does not have this thought that like he knows it all, and that humility is a big advantage.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And it's something where, especially early on, so when Tim and I were talking, it was one of those things where he liked an idea that I sort of came across, and I was like looking at all of these late books, and I was like, listen, they're the ones setting the expectations. So once the expectation is set, that's when people get upset. So what we need to do is set the expectation far enough out where most likely we will actually be early on delivery. So it's you under promise and over deliver. Most of these people, they are making promises that they can't keep, and they're not doing it. So it's like one of those things where if you surround yourself with these guys that are open to different ideas and willing to say like, listen, I don't know, what do you think? What do you think? Everybody on the team is going to come up with a good idea, something that you didn't think about that you could implement in your own campaign to make it better than it would be if you didn't know that individual.
Yeah, you don't want the sales guy out there making his pitch, because they'll shoot the moon, and then you have like what was that game? No Man's Sky. You have the No Man's Sky situation where it's like, oh yeah, we're gonna include all these features, guys. We don't have any of those features. When are we gonna just release the game? They won't notice. They noticed.
I think we can call that the cyberpunk if we're talking about video games.
Oh, Cyberpunk too. Yeah. Oh man. Ooh, CD Projekt Red. Guys, what the hell happened?
I was going to say, on the crowdfunding side, I can think of, so we talked about in one of our podcasts where I've backed a few and I'm clocking over a year plus past delivery time. And I told you guys, like, they're running some new campaigns, these same guys, and they look awesome, but I'm not buying on any more of them until I actually get the other ones I've already funded. And I never have had that issue with Iconic. I get my books within weeks, and it's amazing. And I think that's one of the reasons why have such a growing audience.
Yeah, early on with Demon's Match, there was a merchandise item that I wanted, and Tim was like, "Doug, man, you're gonna be biting off more than you can chew at this point in time. I don't think you should do that." And Tim was right, and so I was like, "Okay." I thought about it, and it's like, I'm just gonna do a stripped down campaign. If the guy next to me is the rock band with the laser show and the pyrotechnics, I want to be the acoustic version where it's just me on stage with the music, and that's what it is. So it was just like, here's my book, and it's coming with a little prayer card, and that's what it is. But it's a really good book, and it's got really good art, and it's got a really good price, and I'm going to fulfill it in a hurry. And that was it. There wasn't all the tchotchkes or all this sort of stuff. That was something where Tim's advice was huge in terms of making Demon's Match a success.
No, very cool. And I think again, it's just as we're starting to put this together as kind of this formula for new creators, this question of like, how do you start to become one of the people contributing in this new movement? It seems like first, like honest assessment of where you are. Next is trying to find that team of people to come around yourself that they give to you and you give to them, because right, these are what good relationships are. And then out of that, you kind of get this building over time, which I know when we looked at the Kickstarters on one of our recent episodes, we can see with the iconic campaigns, like you can see these like starting from right kind of like low to mid 5 figures to now I think it was like over 150,000 most recently for the Common America 4. Very successful campaign. So congrats to the guys on that. And it's that type of steady building and that discipline that seems to be the real formula, not the one-off genius.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that look at the statistical outliers. That gets back to the 80-20 rule, the Pareto principle, where you have, I don't know the exact breakdown, but you're going to have a couple people that are going to be making insane amounts of money. But the vast majority of people are not going to be making that. And so the vast majority of people should not expect to be an overnight success, and they should expect to play long ball. And to build that audience base over time, you gain respect by getting the books out on time, by giving them books at a fair price and quality books that exceed their expectations, and not just thinking like, okay, well, I'm going to put this book out, and because this idea is so awesome in my head, the world will just automatically assume that, Soulfinder is the greatest thing and it should be a movie tomorrow or something. It's like, no. If it's good, you need to be able to think long term. You need to have a 5-year plan. That would be nice. And I think a lot of people, they just think like, no, I'm going to release one book and it's going to be awesome. And it's going to make me $100,000. You're like, if you're motivated, but if you think any comics is about making money, that is your priority, you're probably going to fall on your face. Maybe not, but I would put the story and the art before anything else. And eventually, if it's good, the money will come.
And the bundles, which is clearly one of the things that I think is the keys to crowdfunding long-term success. A lot of guys sleep on the bundling because when you got to make sure you have the bundle tier where you can get the previous books along with the new one, which Iconic always seems to do. I'm sure that, and you mentioned maybe doing an omnibus, down the road for your crowdfunding campaign. Those things right there kind of eliminate that barrier of entry. When you've got someone like, if you're doing a successive campaign, I think some creators like sleep on overprinting to drop your unit cost down, thus giving you a lower cost per unit supply to bundle with your next one to increase your profit per unit, which is, kind of getting into a little more business nuts and bolts. But I definitely see that from in the Iconic model with when I look at the crowdfunding, I can see like there's always the bundle. And I'm sure that it's also one of the ways you do that is by overprinting on your initial run so you can drop your unit cost down and then have that back supply to either sell on the Iconic website individually or then create the bundle packages for the subsequent campaigns.
Exactly. Yeah, these are little things that people don't always think about. And once they get into it, they'll understand like, okay, it makes far more sense to order, I'm just making up a number, 1,200 of these books than actually 500 because it's going to be cheaper. And if you are in it for the long haul, like you said, you're going to sell those books. If your first book is good and the second one comes out, you're going to have more people coming in who want that first book. So you might as well just get the 1200 instead of 500 to try and save a little bit of money early on for whatever reason. And that gets back also to the accounting, where you really got to think about the things you think about if you want to be successful, because if you don't, you're going to get blindsided by all sorts of things.
Now, this is a question that's kind of a little more abstract and is going to maybe get your more journalist, observational, former YouTube creator hat on. Do you find, as we're talking about like trying to create content and culture products that kind of reinforce traditional values but are still entertaining, one thing that is something I've noticed is that people on a certain side of the political spectrum are far less inclined to put their dollars behind cultural efforts and financing those things in turn. Like you said, there's usually, you got to put like a couple of years ahead into thought, and you might have to really make things successful. Sometimes you got to invest more early, so you've got all the stuff ready to go to continue going on. It seems like you've got a team over at Iconic that's thinking about that, that's realizing that you need to kind of put, effort, financing, and skill into creating cultural content. Do you, from just like a 50,000 feet perspective, kind of feel like that maybe on the side that we may lean towards, which is just, traditional values content, and also just good content that's not necessarily pushing a crazy kind of agenda, that maybe the money that should be there to help support those arts is not there? And if so, what the kind of future would be for that kind of thing?
Yeah, there's a good interview that Wes from Thinking Critical did with Brett R. Smith recently on that. And he was talking about men and women with deep pockets who generally agree with us. They would much rather put millions of dollars into think tanks. And I know this for a fact because I worked for a think tank. They will give a lot of money to these white papers where you go up to Capitol Hill and it's all the issues condensed in a succinct way, and vote this way because this is what this think tank says, and this think tank they're super smart people or whatever. But they don't understand that the culture is incredibly important. And in fact, the politics, the politics is downstream from culture sort of thing. And it's very difficult. A lot of people that claim to be quote unquote culture warriors, when I reached out to them with Demons Match, I didn't even get an answer. I didn't get a no. It was just silence. And it was a very interesting experience. Just Some Guy was actually one of the biggest supporters, brought in the most in terms of YouTubers of sales to Demons Match. Just Some Guy is an atheist. I'm a practicing Catholic, but I went to other Christian organizations and individuals and had the door slammed in my face. So it was a very interesting experience to have an atheist be my biggest supporter in many ways on Demons Match, and have other Christians sort of give me the cold shoulder for whatever reason.
And what's crazy is if you look at the math, and because I think you mentioned Brett R. Smith a second, he, if I remember right, was part of the Clinton Cash graphic novel team. What did that cost to probably make? I mean, a comic book graphic novel from production, if you pay, your artist a decent amount of money and you got content, a book might cost with, printing involved, maybe 15 to 20 grand on the high end, depending on your print run. And the cultural impact you can get out of that 20 grand investment as compared to a big check to a think tank is just crazy to me, why there's not more people like looking at that and saying, I can make an evergreen product. Like Soulfinder is not something that's only going to be applicable in 2021. It'll be something that can be reprinted, and that investment becomes an evergreen investment.
So when I worked at the think tank, I worked in their Young Leaders program. And so I helped deal with the intern program, but I also traveled all around the United States with policy experts going to different colleges. Part of that was actually, I would sometimes do side trips to meet with donors and speak with them so they know that the think tank is thinking of them. But they would have people that were called quote unquote legacy donors. So you'd have this little old lady or her husband. When they die, every single year they would give essentially $1 million or maybe more or whatever it was to the think tank. And it would just keep going and going and going because they were so rich. And I would think, imagine if every year the iconic comics guys could get $1 million to hire artists and writers and colorists to churn out content in animation and maybe get into indie movies. But I don't want to question the old lady who died and gave her legacy money to the think tank, but it's like there is something very important about culture, and there's value in art, and just I don't know. It's just sad. A lot of these.
Yeah, you're reminding me of a really great podcaster. This is a libertarian Catholic known as Tom Woods. He wrote a great book, The Church and the Market. Actually, he's wrote a ton of books. And I remember him making a very similar point that if you look at the money thrown into presidential campaigns, you could take a small fraction of that, hire all the best professors, and essentially like create a set of college degrees just for free. It's like, think of like, you're right, like the type of like libraries, or like I did a lot of time in maker spaces. Like imagine if you had like artist maker spaces for people to go and work on their projects like this and to build those networks so that you have those creator teams going into the future.
And it's depressing when you see what a lot of these think tanks, or I used to work in corporate media. When you see what these corporations or these nonprofits spend the money on in terms of black tie events, first class air travel. I was flying in the, the business class or whatever, and eating Taco Bell or whatever. But the top dogs, the VPs and all of that, they're flying first class. They're eating at the best restaurants. That's where the donor money is often going. And again, if I had $1 million a year to spend on Soulfinder, I promise you I would be doing very cool animation sort of things, and I would be getting books, and I would be finding awesome writers and all over the place, being very productive. But I don't know, it's tough because it sounds like sour grapes on some level, but it is frustrating when people don't get how important art is.
I don't even think of it as sour grapes. I mean, in my day job, I run a business, and I look at it as just like the return on investment is one of your key metrics, right? Like, what am I getting out of what I'm putting in? Like when you decide on a business level what you're going to purchase equipment wise or whatever, that's your, like, what's my return on investment? What am I getting out of it? Return on investment for a think tank, no offense to people who work at think tanks, is, oh great, you get a white paper that might get might get some play in some certain communities, but
right.
I mean, but how many more people I mentioned like earlier, like who, like, think of the cultural impact right now. If you went up to talk to someone about like, what the, when you say the snap, what are they going to think of? Oh, I watched Avengers Endgame and I know what the snap is, or that stuff is going to speak to people for 50 years. And when I grew up, I worked at a movie theater, and one thing that I always thought was funny was like in I think it was 98, Shakespeare in Love beat Saving Private Ryan for like Best Picture. And I worked at the theater, and I saw people coming out of the screening and I could tell them, I was like, this was a terrible choice. Like, people come out of Shakespeare in Love and like 5 minutes later they don't care and forget it. People came out of Saving Private Ryan is like, that movie is going to be something they remember seeing for like 20 years because of the D-Day scene, the Omaha Beach.
Right.
Like, just like at the end of that movie where that last scene where he's like, did I earn it? Was I a good man? Right. People like that. It's 20 years later and I remember that vividly seeing it.
Same here, dude. You just brought that image now.
Yeah. Like the cultural impact of those things is crazy. Like when kind of going to my own experience from when I was there, like a movie like Armageddon, which was just fluff popcorn. Everybody liked it. It was just a fun thing. But you look at the iconography of that movie, it's got American flags everywhere. It's about the can-do spirit, just guys like, as silly as a concept of shooting miners into space, or oil drillers into space to stop an asteroid. It was just dripping in American can-do like culture. And I have guarantee you that in Hollywood right now, there's no way that movie could ever get green light, even though it made bank. It would probably still make bank today if they released that same kind of movie. I think it's because they're choosing to use things as a platform, and we are choosing to disarm ourselves by not making these tiny, minuscule investments. And in the grand scheme, it's minuscule for some of these guys who have hundreds of millions of dollars. Like you said, they could, what would 50 grand to them would be like the donation they make, to the yacht club or whatever, but it could
Right.
finance like 3 or 4 possibly very culturally impactful comic books. It could make animation versions of some of our already successful stuff like Common America. You put that thing or Soulfinder into an animated format and throw it on YouTube now, and you can start getting messages out. And I'm on a soapbox right now, but it really gets me on how it's such a small investment to get such a big return. And it's like crazy that we're not willing to do that.
Yeah, the political class and the media class, they going back to the think tanks again, they spend a lot of that money on just the real estate being close to Capitol Hill. So like, we're 2 blocks from the Capitol. It's like a prestige sort of thing, when really it's like, who cares, dude? Like, it really doesn't like, get a place that's out in Arlington, Virginia for half the cost, and in your own little think tank world, you could actually, your bucks will go a lot further if you actually did that. And it's like on every single level, they don't even do their own thing correctly, because they care about like these vain, stupid things. And it's like they don't get that right, and they don't get the culture right. And so it's up to just individual dudes who are making, I don't know, normal, maybe quote unquote middle class, or maybe even a little less than that, to sink their own money into their books because they believe so much in it.
I know. And in some ways, I mean, that's almost a hero story in and of its own, of just like seeing, like I said, you worked in the think tanks and you worked in that op-ed section. I know Tim Lim is, I believe, an audiologist. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
So like he works alongside that. I know on the podcast, everyone here works full time alongside creating, and yet, right, it's going to be just right. The guys doing this at night or anytime that they can get the time, that those are going to be the great stories people are going to be talking about in 20, 30 years. And it's exciting to see that energy right happening right now as we're making it happen.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, you look at the celebrities and the quote unquote culture warriors and the people on cable news, and they in many ways like complaining more than doing stuff. And it's like, okay, you're not going to do it. You just want to complain. You want to collect paychecks from going on TV and going to college campuses and complaining. It's like, we'll just do it ourselves. We'll just roll up our own sleeves and do what we can in our sphere of influence. And hopefully, if enough of us do that in the aggregate, it will have some sort of impact, or start that snowball rolling downhill to where nobody can stop it.
I've got kind of a pet theory for that, in which not all value is measured in dollars at times, although there are some forms of value you can convert to dollars. And I feel like a lot of the current mainstream culture warriors, it's almost like they're consuming a base of people that they know will like get mad over these issues. So like, okay, let's just find the latest outrage. Let's get these people outraged. We'll convert that outrage into my paycheck for the month. But what happens is over time, you're actually consuming that piece of culture. You're not actually adding anything to it. And it seems like what we're trying to lead instead is say, no, like, what value can we actually create? Like, what are the new stories that will start building that influence? And yeah, it's a very interesting concept.
Yeah, I guess I'm somewhat jaded coming from that background, but over time I've realized that no, there are people across the political spectrum where it's very lucrative to be a complainer and a whiner. It's a lot more hard work to actually create things, whether it's comic books or movies or television shows or websites and all this. But it's easy to get in front of a camera and just let loose on people that you don't like every day. And if you could build a nice little bank account doing that, then they'll do that. And it's not in their interest to solve the problem sometimes.
That's I do want to kind of circle back to what I mentioned. I'd been watching Doug's content going back a good long time. One of the things I really respect is that there's a lot of guys who started in that YouTube sphere and never really evolved past just complaining about what they were seeing. But there's been obviously some really highly successful people who started making their own content, and that's what I think is important. Like, it's one thing to just, kind of point out at what things are bad, but you do have to try to do things that are good. And,
Right.
and if you're in a position where you can speak that eloquently about all the problems that are present in what I'm familiar with in comic books, and that's where I saw you originally. I think that most people who have that much knowledge of comic books are probably in a position to help create content for comic books. I mean, it's a medium that lends itself very well to allow amateurs to start making content. I don't mean to knock the guys who are professionals and make a good living at doing it, for some of the big companies, but I do think that there's nothing that stops you from being able to write a comic book script. You can find the formats online fairly easy. You can look on, if you don't have an artist that or you can't draw yourself, places like Fiverr and other, options are available for you to look to try to, basically hire people to assist you with making your content. And surprisingly, when you look at it and start budgeting, I think most people could find a reasonable way. And maybe you don't get the highest end comic artist, but you can find someone within your budget to help make your content get out there. And if the story is good, even with art that isn't fantastic or is budget friendly art, you're going to be able to do it. You could do it as a webtoon where you put it out digitally first before you collect it and print it. I just want to use, Doug is a great example of someone who didn't just sit back and circle around in a certain manner of speaking about negative content and kind of just use that to reinforce his own brand or popularity without actually getting out there and putting out his own. And I think that's the way. That's what you need. That's what we should all be looking at doing and creating stuff that we all want to see.
Yeah, thanks, man. I mean, at a certain point in time, with just speaking for myself, whether it was my blog or on YouTube, it's like, okay, I'm pretty good at zinging certain creators that I don't like, and I don't like what they're doing. But am I really just creating content to stroke my own ego? Is that what I'm doing here? And at some point in time, it was just like, I got to put my money where my mouth is. Like, if I keep saying, like, you need to do this, and this, and like you said, at some point in time, if you believe that you got the chops to do it, then you kind of have, on some level, a moral responsibility to jump into the deep end of the pool and show people how it's done. And that's what I've tried to do over the past couple of years, but I've been blessed enough to have a great creative team around me when I needed some water wings initially when I dove in, and they helped me to take them off.
I was gonna say, I mean, really, the just the story of what you're doing over there really is an inspiration for us and for so many listening to this podcast right now, of just people who are thinking, it's like, man, like, I'd like to try that idea, or I'd like to see if my idea can take off. And I think every time that somebody does it, that is an inspiration to say that it can be done if we just kind of crack the code of how. And it seems like a lot of it is just that willingness to learn and willingness to engage in it every day.
It's been great to watch the sort of network of creators over the past couple of years that have a very similar worldview, and they know that something's not right, sort of congeal together or band together to try and focus all of the creative energy in one direction to see what happens.
And I mean, look, it's been such a great conversation. I think we've already gone over our hour, so I'll kind of open this up one last time for any other questions y'all might have. Otherwise, we'll start winding down.
I got one. I'm a new reader. These books sound interesting to me. How can I get them?
You teed me up perfectly right there, so I better not strike out. Yeah, if people are interested in whether it's Soulfinder, Common America, Black Ops, Brett R. Smith's Aging Poso, Punchline, all of those books, Eric Canetti's Arc Athena, they could just go to iconocomics.com. Everything is right there. Timothy Lim has been great with offering digital versions. I admit I am behind that, but I am working on it. So digital versions will be available moving forward at some point in time. But for the time being, people could go to iconocomics.com.
I just want to confirm I'm on the Iconic Comics website. It was the rosary that you wanted to make, isn't it? Because I see it for sale now.
Oh yeah, no, I got the rosary has been a very good seller for us.
Was
I
that
was
the
actually,
product that you wanted to have initially that Tim talked you out of doing?
No, it was actually sculptures. I wanted to have a sculpture of Father Redder possibly going up against Blackfire as like the giant, snake versus Father Redder.
That would have been awesome, but I can see why the rosaries was probably a more practical choice.
Yeah, and that actually took about a year from the initial negotiations to getting it made and getting it shipped and all of that, but it was well worth it. The people at Rugged Rosaries did a great job.
Awesome.
I was gonna say, now speaking about sculptures, that'll be a preview, I think, for our own podcast. We're gonna be having a sculpture maker coming on in a couple of weeks. That's Steve, by
cool.
the way.
In fact, Doug, if you listen to that episode and you decide maybe I do want to have sculptures made, maybe we'll talk. I'll forward you this information.
Yeah, try and put the guys together. Yeah,
it's all about networking. It's networking.
It's the network effect, dude.
It's not what you know, it's who you know.
So once again, guys, iconiccomics.com. Doug Ernst with the Soulfinder series. It is an amazing set of books. Do check it out. And until next time, we will continue our search.